Hi, I'm Dan Jacob, Vice Director of the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue, or ICDD. I'm joined today by Manfred Steger for the latest entry in ICDD's series, The Crisis. My colleagues and I at ICDD envision this series as a virtual platform to bring in leading experts like my guest to offer their insights on the crisis they see facing global civil society today. Now, the particular crisis at hand in this episode is going to be globalization, so it should come as no surprise as to whom my ideal guest would be, and I'm delighted that he accepted my invitation to contribute to the program. By way of introduction, Dr. Steger is professor of global and transnational sociology at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. His publications, which are extensive, include The Rise of the Global Imaginary, Globalisms, which is in its fifth edition, I believe now, with Roman and Littlefield. And he also has a pair of entries in Oxford University Press's very short introduction series, one on globalization, which is in its fifth printing, as well as neoliberalism, which is coming out with a new edition in 2021. So Manfred, before we get into the discussion of globalization, I thought it perhaps would be a good idea, because globalization is one of those self-evident concepts or categories that we have, perhaps you could lay out a brief working definition that we could go off of before we respond to it in terms of the crisis facing globalization, please.
Sure. First of all, thanks very much, Dan, for having me. I'm really delighted to be on your program. I think a really good working definition for globalization would be, I give you first a long one and then I give you a very short one. I think the long one would be about the expansion and intensification of social relations across world time and world space. So we're talking about increasing and intensifying levels of interdependence. And I think the short definition would be, therefore, intensifying interconnectivity, intensifying interdependence. And that can be measured in terms of a variety of dimensions. And maybe we can get into what these dimensions are a little bit later, but that's primarily, I would say, that's sort of the basic definition of globalization.
Okay. And the first time we met actually was, I believe, a month after President Trump was elected. Actually, right. Speaking at our fellow alma mater at Rutgers to give a talk. And I
3 days after he was elected.
Was it only 3 days?
Yes.
Well, it was a very auspicious occasion meeting you during that time. But I suppose what I'll do is start by asking a question that I asked you at the time. And my question to you was how you saw perhaps the role of globalization and neoliberalism, something we could get into as well, how that might be affected by Trump. And I was just wondering, 4 years on, how you've seen Trump's assault, for example, on multilateralism and sort of transactional bilateral approaches to foreign affairs that might have called sort of underlying assumptions of the inevitability or progressive quality of globalization into question now that that time has sort of passed.
Yeah, I think that what really has happened is what a lot of people see as a paradox, and that is that Trump has embraced what I would call a nationalist neoliberalism. Sounds like an oxymoron. In other words, there are certain aspects of his policy package that are very nationalistic. I mean, economic nationalism. We all know his stance on trade, for example, and his stance on immigration. So as far as the movement of commodities and the movement of people is concerned, it looks like, he wants to shut things down. He wants to take America first. He wants to see take a very protectionist sort of measure, which is, hyper-nationalistic. On the other hand, the interesting thing is, and this is why I call it nationalist neoliberalism, the free market, the embrace of the free market, which, can be summed up in three ways. Deregulation of the economy is one, liberalization, you could say, with regard to trade, and then thirdly, the privatization efforts. He certainly has not shown very much interest in terms of liberalization of trade, but where he has shown extreme interest is in deregulation. So, and he's done this primarily with executive orders, not even so much with legislation, but with executive orders. So he has actually followed very much in the footsteps of extreme free market neoliberals in terms of actually deregulating the economy, specifically, in areas that we are very familiar with, having to do, with climate and the environment would be one. Energy, of course, would be another one. But there are a variety of areas where he's been deregulating, and privatization, the same thing. He's been pushing, for example, which has been in the news lately a lot. This idea that the postal service should be, totally privatized, and actually we don't even need one. It should just be taken over by private companies, which to some extent has happened already. So, there's this real, very, very contradictory movement of, on one hand, embracing protectionism, on the other hand, really, really pushing free market neoliberalism.
Mhm. Well, I think it's interesting the way in this current round, the 2020 re-election efforts, he sort of has been focused on defining his opposition with the dreaded S word of socialism, as against in 2016, it was actually globalism, I think, was the buzzword. I think it was it may have been at the RNC convention where he said Americanism, not globalism, will be our credo.
That's
And
right.
that sort of thing. And I sort of wonder that the DLP formula that you had put together, um, that he's embracing certain aspects of it, but not others. I wonder if perhaps you might be able to discuss the preconditions for Trump's rise in 2015 in terms of identifying perhaps material interests that were in fact impacting certain class elements of the electorate, but packaging it in terms of other things like values or culture, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that he put out relatively early in late 2015, early 2016, this plan and put it forward to a very skeptical GOP, Republican Party, in terms of saying, look, the way I'm going to win this election is primarily by bringing new voters to the Republican Party, and they're going to vote for me. And these, people primarily will be white working class people, right? Remember, I love the poorly educated, right?
Mhm.
Was one of the slogans that he used. So he felt that this long-term prognosis that was out there, that the Republican Party is an endangered species because America is becoming more diverse, and minorities will play a greater role, and minorities tend to vote Democratic. So in the long run, the Republican Party will be, disadvantaged by those trends. He countered by saying, yeah, it may be true that minorities become more important, but I'll get what used to be, union people in the upper Midwest, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Minnesota, and they will come over and they will by far offset, the trends going into a more progressive direction. And I think what's been especially appealing to a lot of these voters is unfortunately the same thing that happened in Europe in the 1930s and late 1920s, early 1930s. And that is, a sort of an embrace of an authoritarianism that takes on a populist idiom and sort of glorifies the little man against the elites and forgotten person against the powerful. And he took, interestingly enough, this sort of progressive idea of the 99, being oppressed by the 1%, which in 2012 was really the slogan, of the left, and turned it around. I mean, adopted it and turned it around and said, yes, that's exactly right. But I'll tell you what the 1% is. That's Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And, that's Obama. That's those elites in the Democratic Party that have forgotten you, that have sold you out. And I'm actually going to take you seriously. So come over, and I think that's how I see, the trend that played itself out. And unfortunately, we now have very good studies that do show that, the white working class actually did vote in record numbers for him and the Republicans in 2016.
I'm actually glad you brought that up. He's been very effective insofar as co-opting messages for his benefit fake news, of course, actually, the term itself in the current climate actually originated with Hillary Clinton when she was using it as a term of derision against folks like Alex Jones and the like on YouTube. And he sort of embraced that image and repackaged it for himself. I guess getting back to that trio of sort of practices that underlie neoliberalism, with regards to that third pillar, or actually the second pillar, as far as trade liberalization, that actually his protectionist policy on that, I should say at least, actually goes in the face of more establishment Republican figures for going back to Reagan and perhaps even before that. Where do you see the Republican Party post-Trump? Do you see sort of a realignment in sort back to sort of the classical neoliberal Washington consensus type policy platforms that sort of predated Trump in the 90s, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, if that's a big if, right? If
Yeah.
Biden wins, we should know, fairly soon. My best guess is that you'll see some of this movement, but it's going to be more dialectical. I don't think that all of the Trump agenda is just going to be dropped like a hot potato. Clearly, a significant part of it. I have a strong feeling that the Republican Party will have to reorganize around personalities or people that are seen as, on one hand, conservative enough, on the other hand, not particularly close to Trump. So watch for people like Mitt Romney to take on, I think, quite a big role if Trump loses. And we all know that Trump is that Romney is a neoliberal, right? And in many ways made his money in terms of privatization, in terms of cutting corporations in very brutal ways to make them more profitable. That's how he, generally speaking, made his money. So I think that there will be some movement back towards this market globalism, if you want to put it that way, or neoliberalism. But at the same time, I think that Romney has to be careful to not lose the message that I think is still reverberating. Even Biden had to take it on, a certain populism, a certain national populism that's in the air that can't be abandoned. So I think it's going to be a tough attempt to bring together, this sort of old neoliberalism and a lighter version, a friendlier version of national populism.
So, well, I guess that would perfectly lead into my next question. From the outset, many in the media and pundits and academics alike have sort of had a hard time locating Trump on the sort of pinning him on an ideology or a coherent ideology of sorts. And I think you may have answered it earlier, but would you identify his ideology in terms of just a rank nationalism, or where would that sort of play out for you if you had to pinpoint what he, and actually his fellow travelers sort of around the world, in other parts of Europe, for example, and Latin America, these rising strongmen that sort of came on the Brexit and then the Trump win. Where would you sort of put them on the ideological map, if you could?
I think he's a right-wing national populist.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is he certainly belongs to, I would even say, to the relatively extreme right in the ideological spectrum, which means that we are talking about an end of a spectrum that's embracing authoritarianism, that's embracing nationalism, that is anti-immigration, that is to some extent, I think to a very large extent, anti-multicultural, anti-political correct, all of those kinds of things, and looks to the past and past traditions without yet at the same time being nostalgic about just recreating the past, but taking some of those. I'll give you a concrete example, right? This idea that America is white or Anglo-Saxon, or at least European or Western, and the notion that this is under attack and we have to protect our cultural sphere. I think, by looking back, you get the values from that, but you have to, at the same time, also put it forward within the current context. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what national populists do quite well. And again, I think social media is extremely important in this process, and Trump has proven to be, very, very good at that. So it's a sort of a digitalization of the nationalist populist message that is deeply, deeply on the right. and yet at the same time also sounds very cutting edge, technologically cutting edge, which again is an echo of the 1930s, right? I mean, Hitler's Nazi party was very much into technology. They were very much identified with the latest in weapon technology, with the latest on radio communication technology. I mean, they pushed this image of being really, really technologically savvy, and I think we're seeing the same thing with Trump as well. So I would see him as a right-wing national populist, as I would see Bolsonaro, as I would see Putin, as I would see Orban in Hungary, for example. Most of them fall into that category.
I guess to get to actually to one of your books in one of your own categories with regards to the different ideological versions of globalism itself, I guess you could say the more progressive elements that still hold on to some neoliberal assumptions. I believe you called them the justice globalists.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see them sort of being able to put up an effective political assault against these national populists?
Well, I think they, what I call justice globalists are basically the people who started out, at the battle in Seattle in 1999. They're actually very critical of neoliberalism. What they do embrace in terms of neoliberalism is a certain sense of cosmopolitanism, a certain sense that another world is possible, a global world is possible, an international world is possible. They do embrace the notion of interconnectivity and interdependence. For the most part, there's some who don't, but for the most part they do. So they're actually quite critical of the market and quite critical of neoliberalism. But what they, I think, looking for, just like the market globalists, is a global interdependent world. And how successful they are in a post-Trump world in terms of pushing the mass message is certainly haven't in the last 4 years. It's certainly been very, very tough going. And you haven't seen, other than the very successful anti-racist movements that we've seen recently. But in terms of, this old agenda of justice globalists with regard to distributive justice, with regard to more focus on the global south and issues in the global south, redistribution, perhaps even a wealth tax, a global wealth tax, the building of global governance institutions that would actually have some real leverage, not just symbolic, but real leverage. That sort of agenda, I think, has taken a real big hit. And you alluded to that before when you said that, Trump has really, been very destructive of this kind of multilateralism, or this idea of a global governance that would invite people or invite countries to actually share sovereignty to some extent, and other kinds of things. So I think that it'll be still pretty tough going for this agenda to be pushed forward. So I think, and that's why I think Biden is trying to embrace this populism from a more left perspective. And this is also where Bernie Sanders comes in, I think.
So I'm thinking in terms of concrete policies, for example, and the extraordinary context in which we find ourselves in with COVID, I'm thinking of something like perhaps the Green New Deal or some sort of other legislative packages that could be embraced by this variant of globalism as an ideology that you identify that is critical of neoliberalism.
Absolutely. And I think that it was very brave of Biden to actually, in the last debate, to say that we have to, sooner or later, switch out of oil and find a way to get into alternative energy. And it's interesting because Trump tried to make a big deal out of it, but it didn't really work. And I think the reason why it didn't work is because climate change has become real for a lot of people, not just in the United States, but around the world. So I think you really put your finger on a very important issue here, Dan, and that is, if you want to push this agenda of justice globalism, I think the best way of doing that is to go through some sort of environmental justice spectrum in terms of, on one hand, talking about climate change and the environment, but on the other hand, also speaking to workers and even, capitalism, corporation industry, and say, hey, there's a lot of money to be made switching to alternative energy. So I think it's going to be that sort of pincer movement that we'll be seeing.
In terms, I guess, going to a more micro approach, what do you see as sort of the greatest hurdles to globalization or impediments to it coming out of, or still having remnants of a era of Trump, but also with regards to COVID, for example, and how that's transforming a lot of the dimensions within globalization as you identified them earlier?
I think education. I think we have a huge education deficit in this country. And, empirically speaking, it's very clear, we're at best 27th in the world, which is not very good. And I'm saying at best, we're probably lower than that. And what you find is a very strong empirical correlation between quality of education and also affordability of education, or at least educational opportunity that's being equalized to some extent. And openness to this kind of agenda, the green agenda, the progressive agenda that we were just talking about. So I think that, countries like Finland, for example, or the Nordic countries in general, who have a very high quality education that's affordable, tend to be also on the forefront of precisely this agenda of not necessarily being totally anti-capitalistic, but talking about a green capitalism, talking about, a green technology, talking about fighting climate change, coming up with real treaties, global treaties that make a difference. So I think, if I would have to say one thing that I hope we can tackle is to make education more affordable, to improve the quality of education, to rethink curricula, to put in much more, I think very positive scientific education, science education that takes seriously what's going on in the world with regard to climate change, pollution, and so on. So I think that's, for me, the core of it. And I'm hoping that, if we get a Biden administration, that the educational agenda is really, really going to be turbocharged.
Perhaps you could actually speak to your own contribution in terms of global studies as an emergent, interdisciplinary field of inquiry that you have made significant inroads in, and how that could also relate to these possibilities and potentials you
Sure. I mean,
for.
Yes, global studies is this emerging and very much growing field. It's transdisciplinary, meaning it cuts across many disciplines. And it's really oriented around globalization and its effects. In other words, understanding, analyzing globalization dynamics and how they play themselves out in space and in time. And also, how we can understand the world in a more critical way, how we can foster reflexivity, how we can foster critical thinking in terms of this agenda of trying to understand globalization. So it would be a sort of an education that's still discipline-based, but ultimately at a certain point, perhaps even already in high school, especially the last 2 years of high school, is starting to move out of a more disciplinary anchor to a more transdisciplinary approach of education that's organized around projects or organized around questions. So rather than saying, what can biology do, or what can chemistry do, or what can political science do, or sociology do, we're asking the question, okay, so here's a specific issue having to do with, climate change, or a specific issue having to do with, let's say, the decimation of species. We just heard that there's a good possibility that by 2100, only 30% of the current species are still around. So we have big topics. So let's bring students around these, sit together around these topics and really understand them in a more holistic way, which would mean that, the status of the specialist that for 100 years was at the very forefront, we became more and more specialized, more and more differentiated, is losing out, I think, in this context, if you want to put it that way, to a resurrection of a more general understanding, the big picture. How does the big picture work? Which is challenging, because it means that students will have to understand a little bit of science, natural science, a little bit of social science, a little bit of humanities, languages, and bring that together in a meaningful way around problem-centered types of projects and questions. And global studies is one of those attempts to bring together people from different disciplines around issues of globalization that we've just talked about.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it certainly would do much to get away from these sort of disciplinary shackles we're all in. I
And
mean,
that was right. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, my own training is interdisciplinary. You yourself are trained political theorist, you're now in sociology, bring all these things to bear to face all these challenges. I think the 21st century going into it, I can't believe we're 2 decades into it already, but it doesn't seem like there's any particular challenge that doesn't take on a global scope and isn't reducible to the actions of a traditional sovereign system, so to speak, in order to mediate those challenges and face those challenges in terms of
exactly. And I,
purity.
and I think if we may come back to, you know, your emphasis at the beginning of the show with regard to COVID and maybe post-COVID world. I mean, here you have pandemics, right? And it sounds very medical and it sounds very scientific. But as we've learned going through these very, very hard months, is that there's a big social aspect to it. Even the term social distancing,
Yeah.
you know, or social media or the Zoomification of everything. You know, it's not just about science. It's about society. It's about politics. It's about culture. And you know, pandemics again. You know, this is not going to be the last pandemic. The good thing, if there's any good thing in any pandemic, is that this is another huge global issue that forces us to think broadly, that forces us to understand the big picture, that forces us out of our silos and cut across and learn new stuff that we are not familiar with, maybe not even so comfortable with, but is necessary to understand.
So I guess in terms to conclude, I think really, in order to move beyond once we get past the post-COVID age, which may be a couple years, and living within normal for some time after that, but also anticipating future challenges, uh, just in terms of a way that you see potential avenues for return to, or sort of picking up the pieces, so to speak, after a post-Trump foreign policy and disengagement from traditional alliances. Thinking of the Iran nuke deal, for instance, or the Paris Peace Accords. You know, dealing with the two. Well, we have pandemic now, but the two traditional existential threats really facing us global security these days, insofar as nuclear proliferation, as well as global climate change. Do you see a way to return to this by using some of globalization's tools, insofar as right now you and I are zooming from thousands of miles apart? So it's interesting that the pandemic should arrive at such a point in time that we have the technology and these flows of information that can really facilitate mediation between civil society as well as governments across the world as well to face these challenges.
It's really interesting that you raised this question, Dan, because you know, in my latest academic efforts in terms of my research, I'm looking at what I call disjunctive globalization, meaning that there's a real difference between certain dimensions of globalization. So if you take, for example, disembodied, what I call disembodied globalization, or you could call it digital globalization, that's leaping way ahead of other forms of globalization, like embodied globalization. In other words, people moving around, right? Even especially during the pandemic, we've seen that people's movements have totally slowed down, yet at the same time, digital globalization has tremendously picked up. You could also say other forms of globalization are sort of limping behind. For example, you know, the movement of objects. We're talking about trade. We know that trade is stagnating. So even institutional globalization, we were just talking about global governance. There hasn't been, you know, much in the last 4 years. If anything, it's gone down. And yet, disembodied or digital globalization is pulling ahead. So there's this disjuncture between digital forms of interdependence and embodied and institutional and objectified forms of globalization. And that disjuncture means that the more powerful digital globalization becomes, the more it's going to start cannibalizing the other forms of globalization. In other words, pulling into its orbit parts of those forms, making what was embodied disembodied. So we're seeing, for example, more and more virtual tourism. It's just as an example, rather than an embodied tourism. or, if you look at objects, right, that more and more, specific, I'm thinking, for example, of remote work, right? The very fact that not just people are working more and more remotely, so that pushes digital globalization, but even the handling of objects is being done more and more remotely. So in a way, I'm thinking of 3D printing, which can, be then localized and so on. So that means that digital globalization is becoming stronger and stronger at the expense of the other forms of globalization. To go back to then what you're saying is to pick up the pieces of a shattered foreign policy in terms of, abandoning treaties and multilateralism. I think the way you pick it up, primarily in a post-COVID world, again, will be through digital interconnectivity. And exactly what that looks like, we don't know. But what we do know is that embodied forms or embodied encounters will drop, relatively speaking, to disembodied encounters. And exactly how that is going to work out in terms of getting concrete policies that might be global, to actually be worked out successfully, nobody knows. But I think as a big picture that's hovering over everything, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's education, whether it's leisure, is this juncture between digital globalization just leaping ahead and the other forms of globalization just kind of falling behind and being cannibalized in the process by digital globalization.
Well, I want to thank you for spending this time here with me, Manfred. It's been a pleasure having you on. I would encourage all the viewers to go out and get as much of professor's literature as you can. It's, if I can say so, it's not only in terms of academic rigor, which is on display. He's a very clear writer, and he was very helpful in my own writing and finding my own voice. So he's very, his writing is very applicable to a general audience as well as to professionals within the academy as well. So with that, I just want to thank you again, Manfred, and look forward to having you again soon sometime.
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.